Good afternoon, good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you are on the planet. This is John Dupuy with Javi Otero again, Spiritual Technologies 2.0. And we have an amazing guest with us, Dr. Jeffery Martin. And I was reading his bio, and this would have to be a mini-series to get through all the things that you've done, Doc. So maybe you could just tell us who you are and what you're doing and the things that you'd like people to know about you.
All right, sounds good. I thought it was a mini series, so I figured we'd just do, multiple episodes and
we could do
get
that
it all in somehow with all of this amazing stuff that we're up to over here. So my name is Jeffery Martin, and I run the Transformative Technology Lab at Sophia University. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Non-Symbolic Consciousness, which is the center, really the heart of research in the academic world for what we call persistent non-symbolic experience or ongoing non-symbolic experience, what you think of as enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical experience, transcendental consciousness, 200 or 300 other words that we've collected from around the world. So we've done a 10-year project with initially over 1,200 people, including many of the really famous ones, all the way down to people who just experienced this in their everyday life. And we transitioned from that into really figuring out that it isn't pathological. I was initially studying well-being, and these people's claims sounded an awful lot like crazy talk to me when I first started out. So the first thing we did was rule out psychopathology involving them. And over time, we've become convinced that these are some pretty amazing ways to experience the world. And so we've been working on helping people to get there. Initially, we thought we could do that with technology. When we got to the brain science stuff, it wound up being deep in the brain. I think you have some other people on that are probably talking about that, so I won't harp on that too terribly much. But basically, the regions in the brain were so deep that we couldn't get at them with inexpensive forms of technology. So we're working on pushing those technologies ahead with people really all over the world. And in the meantime, we developed a protocol using what people in our study said was what worked for them. So we had this unique sample of people all around the world who basically said, this is what worked for me. And we went back and looked at what they said, and then we put it into a protocol that we thought might get us some results, and it did. It actually successfully transitions most people to what we call ongoing non-symbolic experience, which is less than a year. So experiencing it in a continuous way. I'm not an expert in peak experiences or temporary experiences or anything like that. I'm only an expert in the persistent forms of this. And so now we're working on technologies to get people there. We still offer that protocol. That protocol is a course that we run periodically. We still use it for data collection, so it's still part of a research effort. And but really, we're trying to focus also on how we can get it out to billions of people, because billions of people aren't going to take a course. Even somebody like Tony Robbins, as amazing as his courses are, Tony thinks he's probably only reached about 50 or so million people. Well, 50 million people isn't very many people on the planet. And so we're also sitting at the heart of the movement to get this out there with technology. And so that's really what the transformative technology community was formed around. At the very heart of it is this notion of getting people to the highest form of well-being possible. But it's also become really the central movement in the public sphere for technology for well-being. And so it encompasses all kinds of things. I know you'll have Mikey Siegel on, somebody that we worked with early on to help form the consciousness hacking community and stuff like that. So it encompasses things like that. It goes all the way up to the Googles and the Apples and the Samsungs of the world, all the way down to the maker movement, and really encompasses everything in between. So that's what we're working on.
Wow, fascinating. So I gathered from what you said that, and that the brain is actually hardwired for this kind of awareness or this kind of consciousness. Yes, that we all have this piece of this great computer, this organic miracle that's on top of our shoulders, that's actually predisposes us to have this kind of stable, non-dual consciousness.
I'd like to say that's true. We haven't been able to prove that yet. And so here's some interesting facts from our research. Ever since we came out with the Finder's Course protocol, for the first time in that decade of research, really, and this has only been for the last couple of years, we've been able to actually measure people before and after. Prior to that, we can only find people who are already experiencing this and measure them after the fact. And so we really had no idea who they were before. I mean, they would tell us who they were before and stuff, but we knew that their memories weren't very accurate. I mean, how accurate was your memory for who you were 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 years ago or 1 year ago, right? Probably not that accurate. And so the Finder's Course protocol has really allowed us to measure people both before and after, which has been a huge advance in this whole area. One of the interesting things about it is that not everyone does transition. So there have been 8 Finder's Course runs so far. We'll probably do the 9th one somewhere around middle of April, early May. But of those first 4, so the first 4 basically we consider the experiment. And so we really dug into the data on the first 4. After the first 4, we just sort of thought ethically we can't not make this available. So we kept doing them just because it was having this huge impact. But we really dug into the data on the first 4. And so for the first 4, 73% of people basically transitioned to ongoing non-symbolic experience. It's been over a year for a lot of those people now. So we would say that they were in persistent non-symbolic experience. So it's persistent if it's been over a year. It's ongoing if it's been less than a year. If that's confusing, I apologize. In the academic studies, I only did people that were over a year initially. And so I kind of created the term persistent non-symbolic experience for people that were over a year. And now we've got people coming out of things like the Finder's Course that are experiencing it in an ongoing way, but we can't really use that label for them. So we had to come up with the other label.
So that's you came up with the persistent non-symbolic experience. That's great. When I read that the first time, I thought, that's really cool.
It wasn't easy to find a term that everybody could get on board with. That it itself took over a year.
No, when you say the word enlightenment, I mean, there's so many projections and so much baggage. I tell the people I'm working with, if somebody says enlightenment, it's like grab your wallet and your pants and get the hell out of there. I'm not telling what's going to happen. So it's nice. It's nice to be able to I don't know, package it or re-explain it. And I've got so many questions for you. Well, let's start with the first. What actually goes on in this course? What are you doing? And it's a 5-month course. Is that correct?
Let me finish with your last question real quick.
Okay.
So 73% of people basically reported ongoing non-symbolic experience. 26% of people reported temporary versions of it, which are equally hard to get to, as you know, if you're trying to do it with meditation or whatever. So that was also a remarkable finding. Interestingly, though, about 1% of people reported no effects from a non-symbolic standpoint. Now, in most cases, their well-being went up and stuff like that. And so to answer your question, is this available? Is this sort of wired into the nervous system of every single person on the planet? Right now, I don't know. It is possible that there is this tiny percentage of people that may not be able to access it. Okay, so now I'll jump forward to your next question, which is, the Finder's Course is basically 4 months long. It brings in, and the reason it's called the Finder's Course, actually, it wasn't because we thought we would be waking people up in 4 months. It's basically named that because in the research, what we learned is that people have to find a method that works for them. And once they find a method that works for them, they can move very, very rapidly into ongoing non-symbolic experience. So what often happens is that meditation's a little like dieting, right? Which is that, people think to themselves, oh, I want to lose some weight. People think to themselves, oh, I've read all this stuff about meditation. Maybe I should try meditation. And they go out and they search Google and there's like 1 million diets. There's 1 million meditations, right? And so they go around and they start asking their friends, hey, has any of this stuff worked for you or whatever? And maybe they find a friend that can give them a recommendation, or maybe they wind up just trying something randomly off of Google. Well, the downside for them is that none of these really work for a sizable percentage of the population, according to our data. And so, a successful method is something that maybe works for 5 or 6%, maybe 8% of people. And as a result of that, virtually anything that you initially find, unless you're incredibly lucky, is not going to work for you. And so what happened in our research, what we learned is that what happened basically is that people would either try a method and it wouldn't really do much for them. and they would just abandon meditation entirely, or some other spiritual practice. Could be, it doesn't have to be meditation. Or they would fall into the dogma of a group that was promoting that meditation, which just basically said, well, this is the only one that works and you just have to keep at it. And then we would run across people who had tried it for a long, long, long time. Some of them would have transitioned early on because they were in the relatively small percentage of people that were matched up to it at that point. Others would eventually come into alignment with it at some point later in their life, often decades later. And so, you know, their development seems to have changed in such a way that it comes into alignment. I know you've got Ken Wilber, a friend of mine, on here as well. And so, you know, he deals a lot with growing up versus waking up and structures of development and stuff like that. And my dissertation topic was in that area. And so, you know, I think there's some developmental issues that can shift people into more or less alignment with a different method. And so that's another thing that can happen. So people can just stick with it and either eventually get there, or in most cases, people don't get there, that just stick with it, sadly, because you're still trying to shift into a really small target. Or people, you know, learn a meditation. Maybe the meditation comes with dogma that says this is the only thing that works, or maybe it doesn't come with dogma that says this is the only thing that works, but it doesn't work for them and they decide, well, I'll just try something else. And they keep trying stuff until they do find something that works for them. And so, you know, these are generally the paths. And we were able to see it so incredibly clearly in our data with what I guess you would consider sort of successful meditators or successful people who got to persistent non-symbolic experience, whether they were atheists or whether they were spiritual or religious, didn't really matter. So the course name, Finder's Course, actually comes from trying to help people to find the method that worked for them. And we initially set it up as a long-term data acquisition. We thought maybe over the course of a couple of years, you know, somebody in a pilot project would stick with it and, you know, maybe we'd get lucky. But, it turned out over the course of like 13 weeks, 14 weeks, which was the initial length of the course.
That is like the anti-dogmatic approach. That's very cool. I really like that.
Just systematic. That's exactly right. It took us about a year to get stuff in the right order. It took us about a year to figure out how to get around dark nights. Some of these methods are very powerful and they produce dark nights. Some of them are very powerful and that you never run across anybody who has had a dark night produced by it. And so if you're not familiar with the term dark nights are prolonged periods of really sort of negative and dark emotional phases that you can go through. And they can last for a moment or they can last for decades. There's some great work on it by someone named Willoughby Britton at Brown University. It's not being looked into by very many people. But she's doing a great job with it. And so it took us a while to figure out how to mitigate that. That actually doubled the length of the course. The protocol was originally only 6 weeks long.
My next question was going to be this. Do you think there's maybe the people that go to take the Finder's Course, which is just a brilliant idea, are like self-selecting group or just teetering on the brink? I mean, your average guy off the street probably wouldn't go to a Finder's Course. So these people have a deep hunger or perhaps some experience they bring with them that even make something like that relevant to them.
Yeah, it's been all over the map. I was surprised. The initial participants were also a mix. And so even from the very first pilot group, there were people who really had not done any spiritual practices or whatever, all the way up to people who had done them for decades. And since then, people will recommend it to their friends who don't believe in any of this stuff, and they take the course. And so it's actually been a really diverse group of people. It's really spanned all socioeconomic levels, all education levels, people all around the world in every region of the world, because it's an online thing. And so initially, I'm with you, right? I paid a lot of attention to the population and the degree to that they're self-selected and whatnot. And it's difficult to say, it's hundreds of people in, not thousands of people in at this point. There's only so much time in my day to read people's weekly surveys and, sort of keep the train on the tracks, right? And so it's not, basically each course has a limited number of people that we can allow into it. But it certainly seems to me at this point like it's quite diverse. Now, will it work if it's translated into Russian or, French, or, I mean, who knows, right? We haven't done any of that type of stuff yet. But basically, if you speak English and you live anywhere in the world and you of any age range from, roughly your early 20s up into your, I think, the late 70s, maybe early 80s as the oldest people that we've had in there. And we've had more than one of the people. We've had basically more than one person in that age range, all sorts of different belief systems. Right up front in the course, I basically say I'm not going to discuss belief system related things. It's a practice-based course. You're there to basically do stuff. So if you want to send in questions to our support system that deal with philosophy type things or religious type things or whatever, basically the only thing you're going to get back is an email that says, yeah, we're not going to answer things like that. Please just do the practices as we've laid them out and see what happens for you. So we really avoid all of what I call in the mind sort of stuff. The course is really designed to produce a very specific impact. There's no philosophy around it, or
I think Ken calls that post-metaphysical spirituality. You do away with all the stories and the dogma, this and that, and you just get down to what is the actual experience and what works.
Right, so. Exactly. And I don't think of this as spirituality is a tough term for me. I think of this as really just related to the nervous system. I mean, when I look at the data that's accumulating so far from a scientific standpoint, it certainly seems to me like just some fundamental rewiring of our brains. If you understand what the different regions in the brain do, at least as we understand them currently, it certainly seems to make a lot of sense in terms of how these experiences unfold or the different types of experiences that you can have. And so, I guess it's the less mysterious version of it for me as, spending part of my life as a brain scientist. And so this whole spiritual notion, it's a little different for me than probably some of your other guests. What I really feel like we've done is been able to get to the heart of the matter. Our questions in our early research were all around the core cognitive science questions that allowed us to get people to the place where we could scan them neurologically. So it was questions about changes in cognition, affect, perception, memory, sense of self, things like that. If somebody started talking about awareness or they started talking about God, I'd smile and nod and let them go on for a little bit, but then I'd get them back to the questions that I was actually interested in. Because it turns out that you can have so many different forms of experience on top of this core that underlies it all. But, we were only interested in getting down to the actual core and figuring out, what was at the heart of this. And that's what we were successful, being able to do. So you can put all kinds of stuff on top of it. You can put atheist stuff on top of it. You can put religious stuff on top of it. You can put spiritual stuff on top of it. You can co-vary tons of stuff with it. It's very common in India for people to basically learn magic tricks, because even if they've had a shift of consciousness, it's just sort of culturally indoctrinated over there that unless you can do like woo-woo type things, you must not really be experiencing persistent non-symbolic experience. And so you have, people that want to be spiritual teachers often learn sleight of hand tricks and things like that in order to satisfy that culture's need for those types of things. And so there's all sorts of stuff that's often wrapped around these things. But we really feel like we got to the core.
Now, would this be characterized as being a stable observer self that comes online? Would that be a piece of this, or is that, we haven't really defined exactly what you're talking about. So I'm kind of going,
sure.
Seeing what is it actually we're talking about?
Sure. So, well, the interesting thing that came out of the early part of the research, the first several years of research, was really a classification system. So we were able to classify what was going on under the hood of different people's experiences. And we were able to very clearly see that different religions and different spiritual systems had varying degrees of breadth and varying degrees of starting and stopping points along what we call a continuum, basically, of different collections of experiences. We call those locations. And so, for instance, people basically land in one of four locations. So we call those locations 1 through 4. There are other locations after that. We haven't seen anyone make a transition directly past location 4, but we've seen people make a transition directly into location 4, directly in location 3, 2, 1. We see people, a minority of people in the past moved across those locations. Most people stayed at the location they landed in and basically kind of rooted into it or deepened into it. Now with the internet, post-1996, our data suggests, which is about when the internet was really taking off for most people, post-1996, you start to see people moving around more, having more variable experiences with this, things like that. We can talk very simply and briefly about some of these locations. So for instance, location 1, a cognition shift that occurs in location 1, first of all, is a very deep change in what it feels like to be you, away from the negative and sort of towards the positive. And so the vast majority of people's psychology is really sort of rooted in a base level of fear and anxiety, stuff like that. So that forms the foundation of most people's psychology. Now that's not surprising because we're all trying to, our psychology formed to keep us alive. And, if you throw a crumb to a bird while you're eating out at a restaurant on a patio or something, right? What happens with the bird? They kind of, peck at the crumb, and then instantly they're like looking around for what might be swooping down to kill it, right? And then they're pecking at another crumb, right? And then they're looking around to see what might try to kill it. Well, we've all basically got the same nervous system from that standpoint. And so that forms really a base for us as well. And then the way our brain is built, it's built up in layers. And so as evolution is sort of added on, of course, this is my belief from a scientific standpoint, as evolution has progressed further, it's added on different layers of the brain. And as those different layers of the brain sort of arrived, so did additional complexity and ways of regulating emotional responses in different ways and whatnot. And so you ultimately have this fundamental experience of the world. For most people, that's fear, anxiety, worry, stuff like that, a sense of fundamental discontent, like things are not fundamentally okay in some way. You've got to have goals that will get you to the thing that will finally make it feel okay or whatever. And then all of your experience is really built on top of that foundation and colored by it. To one degree or another, depending on how effectively you've sort of messed around with the layers that sit above it with positive psychology or self-help or whatever. So what shifts right away in any place on the continuum is a fundamental change at that deep baseline level. And it shifts to a sense of completeness, to a sense of wholeness, to a sense where everything's okay. Not in a non-functional way, not in a way that if somebody's pointing a gun at you, you're blissed out and you're like, oh, everything is so wonderful. Oh, look, it's a bullet coming at me, right? You're very, very functional. You're in fact functional in a way that you could never imagine before because you're not basically living your life out of a fundamental foundation of fear and anxiety. So there's a tremendous sense of fundamental well-being that enters in and bubbles up basically through the rest of your psychology. Along with that, it turns out most of our thoughts are primarily self-referential. What I mean is that they're about us as a discrete entity in the world in some way, and that weakens. And people will often say, oh, all of my thoughts went away. And that's not true when you really dig in, but so many thoughts are self-referential that it can really feel like your head just like emptied out. Well, that obviously, makes your mind a tool instead of you being a servant of your mind and it whipping you around with emotions and everything else. You become sort of much more of, that becomes much more of a tool. Negative emotionality falls off much more rapidly right away in location 1 because you're not that, all of those self-referential stories and stuff have lost so much of their weight. And so you don't have, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, there may be arousal. There may even be a brief burst of anger or whatever. You might even flip them off or something. But you're not following them to their house, right? Or tailgating them and honking at them. Or you're not perpetuating the story basically in your head about how they almost killed you and, they've got to learn their lesson or, whatever it is. It comes, it goes, you're back to peace basically. So those are some ways that sort of location 1 looks. Location 2, some of that is more background than foreground in location 1. So you can still be whipped around by positive and negative emotions, even though the negative emotions go away much more rapidly and whatnot. But you can still have an experience of that. We have all kinds of psychological conditioning that can still be triggered and stuff like that in location 1. And so in location 2, you basically just have less of that happening. And so let's say that, your boss calls you into the office and gives you a stern talking to, and you basically have, you feel sort of leaving very threatened, very personally threatened, almost like a tiger was running at you and threatening your life kind of thing, because of just the way we're programmed in modern life. So in location 1, if you're in the throes of that conditioning, you should still be able to look down deeper beyond it and find that baseline level of well-being. Doesn't mean that you won't still be experiencing that conditioning. That baseline level begins to move increasingly forward through the different locations. And so by location 2, your negative emotions are far fewer. You basically have a positive, what we call a positive valence, or sort of a dominant positive emotional state. And that background sense of well-being is up more. By location 3, it's exclusively a positive emotional state. And this is the unitive state of Christianity. It's sort of the end point of the Christian mystical path, where you feel sort of one emotion. It feels like a mix of love and joy and compassion, things like that. One of those facets is usually more dominant at any given time. Your mind your self-referential thoughts are almost totally gone by this point.
So is this where at location 3 is where you start to see the increase in the compassion and love and agape and eros and what's the other one, brotherly love, that starts to come online at that point?
You're feeling pretty good the whole time, right? And so it makes you pretty nice, generally speaking. But yeah, absolutely. That's where it's maxed out. People say, people that are entrepreneurs and stuff say it's hard to run a company from location 3 just because you feel like, you have a tendency to give away the store, sort of. That's a good way of thinking about that.
I've done that.
And then location 4 is totally different. Location 3 can bring with it some people are inclined towards a feeling of the divine, some people aren't. And so if you're inclined towards the feeling of the divine, then it feels sort of like this maximum unitive state with the divine and all of that. If not, you get sort of a panpsychist experience where it's sort of like everything is conscious and you're sort of in a maximum unitive state with everything being conscious and that kind of thing. But then you transition to location 4 and there's a huge change. Emotionality falls away. The sense of agency falls away. Agency has changed throughout all of us. You can have somebody at location 2 really feel like there's no them there doing anything, but that means something very different at location 2 than it does at location 4. So there's a lot of nuance here that we can't talk about in a short conversation like this. And so, the love that you were experiencing as your dominant foundation in location 3 goes away in location 4. Your sense of the divine goes away in location 4. Your sense of agency really goes away in location 4. But location, and that all sounds, everybody's like, why would I ever want to be in location 4? But once people experience location 4, there's such an incredible sense of freedom, even compared to what came before it on the continuum, that people very rarely want to go back to location 3. And you can see this, you can see some people who have struggled publicly with this, like in Bernadette Roberts' books. She's probably one of the greatest living Christian contemplatives. She's Catholic. She really fell off the end of the Christian mystical path, which pretty much ends at location 3. And she fell off into a location 4 experience, and there were no books to help her. There were no writings to help her. She just basically had to feel her way through it. She wound up writing some books because, the books from previous centuries had been so incredibly helpful to her. And so she contributed to that literature to help people that came after her that fell into it. And in her writings, you can really see some very clear descriptions of location 4 and a very intense struggle for someone who went from a strong belief that location 3 was really the end of this thing into location 4. And in case you're wondering, we don't really think there is an end to this thing. We think that you can go as far as you want to. And this is a very important point, actually, that I want to make. Just because you can go far doesn't mean that you necessarily should. I was hosting a conversation around the SAND conference with Rick Archer, who does a podcast called Bat Gap. And so we used some of our facilities here at Sophia University, and we brought in a bunch of the spiritual teachers for a conversation with each other, essentially. And so we all were on like this big panel, just having a conversation that Rick was directing. And while I was on that panel, I was noticing that most, if not all, of those teachers were really pedal to the metal, sort of philosophically. about this, right? I mean, they had sort of oriented their lives to go as far as they could on the continuum. And as I was sitting there, it really struck me. I talked to teachers years and years and years ago, and since then I've mostly been conducting research with ordinary people, because I'm very interested in how this plays out in ordinary people's lives, because there's so many ordinary people who experience this and they don't really have a frame of reference for what's happened to them lots of times and whatnot. And so I've been immersed really with just normal people who experience this for a long time now. And I was listening to these teachers and they were so pedal to the metal, I'd sort of forgotten that about them, to be honest. And so I made the point, hey, listen, the people who are out there listening to your videos aren't spiritual teachers. They have mortgages and they have families and they have, life complications that, they're not going to just move to a cabin in the middle of nowhere somewhere and just deepen into this or, radically change their life in such a way that they can just go further and further and further and further into this. There's another way to view this. And you really have to give people permission to view this as just another thing that integrates into their life in a healthy way. So, for instance, for me, the Finder's Course protocol, when we were playing around with it, transitioned me, actually. I was its first successful person before it was a course or whatever, when we were just experimenting with onesie-twosie people associated with our organizations and stuff. And for a long time, when I was doing the research, I really resisted any transition to this because I didn't think I could be objective. But eventually, somewhere around 2010, the end of 2010, it started to occur to me that this research was solid, that there were a lot of people doing it around the world, that basically I could get hit by a bus and it would just keep going on. And that if I transitioned to this and if I started sounding like a loon, the people that were still doing the research that were credible scientists would just sort of push me off into a corner and keep going, right? And so I decided, hey, I want to experience this. And it's time, it's safe to finally experience this. So, but personally, I keep myself around the end of location 2, because I find that that's where I'm most effective. I may choose to drift up to location 3 around the holidays when I don't have a lot of work to do or whatever else. But I think there's another way to view this, and it's not that it's just pedal to the metal, but rather what are these different things good for? And if you are embedded in a certain life and you're doing certain things, location 3, location 4 might not be appropriate for that. Maybe location 2 is most appropriate for that. Or maybe location 3 and location 4 are most appropriate for that, whatever. But one thing I want to do is just give people permission to not put the pedal to the metal and to think of this as something more practical to just integrate in with their life.
Could you say a little bit more about the experience of location 4? So this feeling of personal agency goes away, and what else does it involve?
Yeah, so you literally feel like you can't make a decision. You feel like you can't do anything, like you're not doing anything. It's all just happening. It's all just unfolding. Life feels completely synchronistic. You have a loss of everything that's an emotion, which turns out includes love. You have you have some perceptual shifts that go along with that. You have some memory effects, actually, that go along with it. Your self-referential system, that individualized sense of self, has changed so much by this point that people can have lapses and in memory, basically. So I had one guy, for instance, show me his phone, and he had this long task list on his phone that was color-coded in different ways. And it's because oftentimes in that state of consciousness, you will remember things that are routine, like you'll remember to pick your child up at 3 o'clock every day or something like that. But if there's an oddball thing in your schedule, like a doctor's appointment, you just tend to not store it. And so you learn to keep a calendar, keep lists. You go into location 4 people's houses and they often have lists, stuck to their purse or stuck to the refrigerator or stuck to the TV or stuck to the toilet seat, or stuck to places where they're likely to just look. Anyway, so there are some memory effects of this. And incidentally, if you ask people, well, hey, would you like to go back and leave location 4 because of these memory issues that you're having? They're like, no way, right? There's no way that they want to go back. To them, this is just something that they can manage in the same way that you manage other things.
Is there still a sense of personal vocation I'm here to do a certain work in the world, this is my task, or do you just kind of hang out with what was there before you hit it? Like, I'm a parent, this is what I do.
That's a really great question, and it leads actually to a different type of answer that doesn't just relate to location 4. So there's a deepening process that happens with this after the transition, and there seem to be 2 primary stages to it, one that occurs after a couple of years and one that occurs within 7 years or so. Now, those aren't the same number for everybody down to like the last minute or something, right? I mean, people are a little different, but average it out, and that's basically what you get. So during the during the initial phase of this, during the initial couple of years of this, you really have your brain trying to work out what's going on. And so you've spent, if you think about it, up to that point, your entire life with a certain set of goals. And those goals were large, they changed over time and whatnot, but the thing that largely drives them is a sense of incompleteness, a sense that you need to do something, that you need to get something else in order to be happy, or in order to feel complete, or in order to X, right? Well, now you don't feel that anymore. There's no need for that anymore. And so you're essentially out of alignment with this goal system that you've wired into your brain since you were who knows how young. And it takes time for your brain and just the way it works and the connections in it and whatnot to unwind those things. And that seems to happen primarily over the first couple of years. So there's different things that can happen to people. For some people, especially if they were super depressed before they transitioned into this, for people that were super depressed, they often feel like, oh my God, I've got to get this to other people, right? And they're super motivated and they change their life to basically try to get this to as many people as they possibly can, right? Other people will experience a tremendous lack of motivation because all of the goals that they were moving towards are just no longer relevant. And in the meantime, if they don't do anything, they just feel this tremendous sense of peace. It's like, life is awesome if you're just sitting there doing nothing, right? Life is awesome if you're doing stuff, but life is also awesome if you're just sitting there doing nothing. And so there can be motivational issues with people that they have to deal with. What happens usually after the end, over the course of that couple of years, is that the brain figures it out. And what starts to happen is you really don't have those goals anymore, but there's just something that's kind of unknown to you, and I think maybe even unknowable, that just starts propelling you in certain directions. And so religious and spiritual people talk about basically God's will, right? To them, this is God's will taking over. As a scientist, I'm less likely to call it God's will. I don't know what it is. I think it's basically just your brain rewiring off of earlier conditioning and tendencies. People generally keep going in the same direction. So unless you were a lawyer that really hated your job as a lawyer or something like that, you just pretty much keep, your life just, it keeps going.
So it sounds like in the beginning part of location 4, there's a deconstruction process that goes in. All the old stuff is just kind of let go and just open. And then there begins, as you move on into a subtle reconstruction of what you're here to do and how that, given this new consciousness, how that, how then one moves and does in the world. And feeling like you're the instrument of something greater, like Javi and I are both musicians, and you get into, or, a tennis player, whatever it is, you get to this place at the highest levels of performance where you feel like the music is doing you and you're not doing the music, or the game is doing you. And it's just it's an amazing, beautiful experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It can feel different ways in different locations. I would say it's not just a location 4 thing. That 2-year process happens regardless of where you're at, regardless of where you land on the continuum. And
how do you measure the baseline states for people so you can know the location? And also, I'm really interested about how do you make the shift? How do you get somebody and how do you make them shift?
So I measure the baseline locations pretty quickly with just assessing them with questions. We have a whole bank of questions that we've never published, and basically you either know the right answer to it or not. And if you answer a certain way, I know what location you're in. So for me, that type of assessment is very simple. Now, it wasn't always very simple. Originally, our interviews were like 12 hours long. I mean, I used to say that I would go to people's houses. I was traveling around interviewing our research subjects in the beginning, right? And I used to say that I would basically stay there until they kicked me out of their living room. And if you meet our research subjects, like I'll be talking in a group, right? And one of the research subjects would be there, and they're like, "Yeah, he's not kidding." He would literally stay until I
How was it taking you?
He would just keep digging and digging and digging and digging. But over time, I mean, now we have a very solid set of questions that we don't share, that we don't release, that we don't publish around. And we haven't published a lot of our stuff because we don't want people to be able to fool us. We're still very much involved in an intense research project here. And so the more we publish, basically, the more you could fool us. And we don't want to be fooled. We want accurate data. So we get a little bit of criticism from the academic establishment for not publishing more, but we just don't want to hurt validity, essentially. We do participate in, I speak at most of the major conferences and stuff like that in the academic world. So we do participate in the way that you're supposed to while you have an ongoing research project to get your data peer reviewed and all of that. But this is still very much an active research program for us.
And are you encountering people that have not gone through the finder's course that are just some other way or just spontaneously getting into one of these 1, 2, 3, or 4 locations?
Well, that was the first, 8 years.
Yeah. Yeah, because
I researched for the first 8 years.
11 years ago, I had a very powerful non-dual awakening. And, luckily I was a student of transpersonal psychology, so I knew the literature, knew I wasn't going crazy. But I found Arjuna Ard's book, The Translucent Revolution. It kind of jumped off the shelf at me. And it's like, oh, okay, this is cool. And it was like, gee, one of the big thrust of the book was, this is happening all over. It could be the guy sweeping the street, or it could be the maid in the hotel room, or the CEO of the company, whatever. But this kind of awareness is starting to, he called it translucent, how the ego structure becomes more translucent, lighter, not as, bought into the old stories, the old conditioning, and more light gets through, and there's just a sense of more peace, more compassion, more being okay, even though everything may look like it's going to hell in a handbasket, right? There's just a profound shift, and he said he was finding this. Anyway, I found that was a very useful book for me at that stage.
So that book was around back then, and so that was very fortunate. It was neat the way he really got stories from a lot of the teachers that were around at that time. I think translucent is a really good way of describing things like location 1 and location 2, maybe a little less so for location 3 and especially at location 4. I don't think you think of it as translucent so much as just gone. And then beyond location 4, definitely gone. Increasingly even more gone. I think at each level, at each location beyond 4, you're sort of surprised by how much more there is to go, because it doesn't feel like there's anything left. But a lot of the public teachers are right in the sort of the location 2 range. And so that makes a lot of sense with the term translucent.
And is there a point where all of these 4 locations start to become integrated? It's like your 1, 2, 3, and 4 at some further developmental stage down the road?
Not really. They're quite different from each other, but that does lead to an interesting question, which is what happens at location 4? And what happens at location 4 is people make one of 3 choices. They either, even though they say that they can't make a choice, right? Now, if you just land in location 4, you actually do have that 2-year sort of deepening period, just like you do at any other location. And you actually have a little bit more agency, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like you have agency. But you can wind your way out of it. You can especially do that in the first few months of it, before there's kind of a next sort of stair step down into it. And it's kind of interesting how people do that, actually. They do it by noticing that when they get triggered, even though no emotion arises, that there's like these little fragments of what used to form together to become emotions that they can sense. So we call those proto-emotions. There's a public teacher named Ken Folk who I was talking to one time and who used the term proto-emotions for those, and I really liked that term. And so there's sort of these proto-emotions, and they learn that if they can trigger, it has to be something really strong that triggers them, right? Like, because so much stuff is gone by that point, but some like really intense thing around a family situation or something like that can sometimes do it. And so if they can get a sufficient degree of trigger, they can just get this very faint, very, very faint glimmer of a proto-emotional type thing happening. And if they can then lock their attention on those proto-emotions, they can eventually, and keep their attention on those proto-emotions, they will eventually reform into emotions, and it will pull them back out of location 4 and into location 3 generally. And so anyway, they basically make one of 3 choices. They either choose to go back, or they choose to stay in location 4, and they feel like that's the place that's the quote-unquote proper place, which is one of the things that we deal with. People will take a look at our continuum and they'll be like, boy, congratulations on really getting down, you know, what awakening is or what enlightenment is. Your description of location 4 or your description of location 3, man, that's just dead on. But hey, listen, those other locations, you know, they're not the real enlightenment. And so, you know, we deal with stuff like that all the time, people wanting to make judgment calls, which is why we call these locations and not levels. So some people go back. We call those people fluid 4s, because usually when they go back from location 4, they can often move around the continuum. They can get some skill at moving around. Usually they don't go below location 2. And they often view it as sort of the way I was viewing it, saying it earlier. I mean, I would classify myself at this point basically as a fluid 4. And so, you know, you heard me say, well, location 2 is where I'm most effective to do the transformative technology space and, you know, lead things like the TransTech Lab and stuff like that. And, you know, but this Christmas, I had a couple of weeks where I wasn't doing any of that. And so I allowed myself to drift up into location 3 and really enjoy the holidays from this amazing, you know, experience of location 3 as an example. And then I had the CES conference on the other end of that. And so I had to pull myself back down to location 2, to the end of location 2. And so you hear a fluid 4 basically talking like I talk. Some people believe location 4 is it, you know, it's what enlightenment really is. And so for those people, they just root and dig into location 4 and they never move from it. And then some people get the gist that, oh, wait a minute, this is a really different place than the place before it. And it seems like it might be a launching pad to something further. So they explore that. And, you know, they move on to location 5, 6, whatever else. So location 4 is kind of an interesting point on the continuum when people make one of those 3 decisions once they hit it.
And how do you make the transition? How do you create the shifts for people? What tools do you use?
Yeah, the only thing that I know to recommend is really our Finder's Course protocol. I would have never invented it if, you know, we would have never created it if there was something else out there that we could use, because the only thing that we wanted was A/B data. We just wanted before and after data. If there was something else out there that was reliable, we'd be using it. I feel like I've been everywhere, talked to everybody. It just didn't exist. We tried some things that we thought, you know, people really swore that, you know, that they were the thing that would do this for us, but they just didn't work for us. And so I think, you know, it's the only thing that I really have to recommend is the Finder's Course protocol, which, you know, a little bit, unfortunately, we have to limit the number of people who can participate in it because I only have so much time. And we also limit how often we run it.
So you're not using any known,
so much time.
You're not using any known tools. You're not basing your approach in any tools that have been used before or have been invented recently. I don't care.
It's a cocktail. That's really sort of the issue with it. So it's a very, very precisely timed sequence of roughly 30 different things that unfold over that 4 months. And I tell people when they take it, you know, listen, if you don't feel like doing something today, I mean, that's fine, but just keep in mind that you're hurting your chances. So, I mean, it really is a very sort of precise, you're locked in march step with the other people who are going through the protocol. at that time, I've tried to make it available. I put up for my last birthday. Every birthday, I try to give something, cool to the world. So for my last birthday, I put up these videos that basically told people how to create their own finder's course and whatever. And nobody does it when you do that, because it's a sophisticated cocktail. And so people start all excited, but then they just don't have the willpower to keep themselves going through it. We have a lot of psychological levers built into it that basically ensure people's compliance and whatnot. So that's one of the reasons why we're trying to improve it. It's the most efficient thing I know of, but I don't think it's as efficient as it can be. So what we're doing this year is this next one that runs in somewhere in the middle of April or the 1st of May. We're incorporating physiological measurement into it. And so we're going to be using probably the Interaxon Muse, probably a polar heart rate strap, and a GSR device. I actually have the GSR device sitting around here somewhere. Oh, right here. So we're going to use this GSR device, actually, which is an eSense thing from Germany. These are just the electrodes, and these things just go on your fingers like this. And it picks up GSR, which is just a measure of your sympathetic nervous system. And so we're hoping, and we're using a back-end software from a company called Neuromore, whose founder has taken the finder's course and all of that. And so we're basically going to do this huge data collection effort, and we're going to try to see if we can shorten it, make it easier to sort of tailor to people at an individual level so they don't have to go all the way through the 4 months and whatnot. We're hoping that we can find things in the physiological data. If you don't know what the Muse is, I didn't mean to skip past that. The Muse is an EEG headset. And so we're basically looking at brain waves, ECG, and GSR, and we're hoping to find something in that data as people go through it that we can use to shorten up the process.
That's really interesting. I was going to ask you about physiological measurements, because I suppose you're familiar with the work of Max Cade and Otherwise, and they kind of started in a similar way as it sounds that you've done. So
yeah,
really interesting to know.
I've tried to find those same patterns in people and haven't, but I don't have a mind mirror. The thing is that we use really sophisticated EEG software. And so it's not just like a couple of electrodes, it's 64 electrodes. It's called high density. So it's the kind of thing you can like publish in Science and stuff with, And so our patterns are just different.
And Dr. Jeffrey, what you were saying earlier, you were talking about, a stable location 4, but then over the holidays, right, you've got to sit at a table with your family members. So it really helps to kind of inhabit this more functional communal thing instead of just going turkey.
That's certainly one way to look at it. In my case, I love my family. We don't have friction. I just, location 3 is just such an awesome place. I mean, I think if you were just, it's easy to see why the Christians would pick it, and some forms of Buddhism pick it as the end stage, and some forms of Hinduism pick it as the end stage. It's easy to see why, because it's an awesome place. I mean, you just feel, this one dominant emotion all the time. It's pretty incredible. So I was really just kind of doing that for enjoyment.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in other words, it seems that if you are at, say, a mature, stable location 4, you can choicefully kind of go down to floor or location 1 and ride the elevator up to 2 or 3 as you feel.
Yeah,
I don't know, whatever that is to do such a thing.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. There are significant shifts in your perspective and how you, I guess, perceive the world, or maybe your philosophy of the world or whatnot, that occur with each one of these different locations. Just because you've experienced things so differently. And so even when you're in, I'm sitting here at kind of let's say, location 2.75 or something right now. But my location 2.75 is informed by a memory of, and it's just a memory at this point, of what location 3 is like and the perspective on the world that location 3 brings. And it's informed by location 4 and the perspective that location 4 brings. I haven't gone beyond location 4 because I noticed that oftentimes people can't go back. And so lots of times people, they go to location 5 and they want to go further. But I don't want to sort of get stuck past location 4. And so I've chosen to go the other way. And so I have these other perspectives, but they're mental representation perspectives. And so it's kind of interesting because from a fluid force standpoint, although I'm sitting in location 2 right now, and although the dominant way of perceiving the world is location 2, it's informed ultimately by memories of the perspectives of location 3 and 4 as well. And so even, location 2 is not just location 2 when that's the case. So there's so much complexity here. It's so rich. It's so fascinating. It's really kind of cool. And
how long do you need to stay in each location to have a feel for what it is and have a memory that can inform when you go down the levels again? Or
I've never really thought about that. I think it's hard to not have it right away. That would be my guess, but I haven't asked people about it. I haven't collected data on that. That's just my own personal experience. It's a good question.
So the work that you're doing now, basically kind of the cutting edge, is just to refine this program and make it more effective, maybe less time, so that more people can begin to achieve these different locations more efficiently. Is that kind of what your cutting edge as far as the work that you're doing in the world?
Well, that's in one part of my life, but that's not all of it. So the other thing that we can talk about today, if you want, because it really relates to your whole series, is I'm also essentially the founder of the Transformative Technology movement, which started as a movement towards, getting technologies to move people towards these extremely amazing states of well-being, and has broadened out from there to basically be the technology for well-being type of movement in the broader world. So that word is being used all over the place now and whatnot. And I actually have sitting around me, because I'm in the Trans Tech Labs TV studio, I actually have sitting around me some devices that I don't think I saw on the list of people. So like I don't have a Spire sitting here because I saw that NEMA was going to be on, but I have some other devices if you want me to sort of show people kind of what's out there and maybe talk a little bit about how it relates to the notion of your series.
Absolutely. Please.
All right,
do.
so I'm going to look away from the camera for this to just kind of pick things. So I already showed you the GSR sensor. That's one thing that's really helpful. That's an old technology, and it measures essentially electrical resistance in the sweat glands, but that's a direct way to measure the sympathetic nervous system. There aren't very many ways to measure the sympathetic nervous system. A blended way to measure it is with a device like this. This is a heart map device. And so it has a little clip. This one goes on your ear. It can also go on your finger. And so you just kind of clip it on your ear. And then you plug this into a computer where they also have phone versions. And there's software that shows you heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is a combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So sympathetic nervous system is when you're, you're really sort of, agitated, or you're on it, or even you're really focused or whatever. Your sympathetic nervous system is active. Your parasympathetic is like, oh, yeah, so, how's it going over there these days, guys? Have a nice peaceful day here. So it's more like the relaxed version, right? And these systems are always kind of battling it out. And so one is trying to hit the gas and the other is trying to hit the brakes. They're always going back and forth. And so heart rate variability is a way to deal with both systems at the same time. The sympathetic nervous system stuff basically just deals with the sympathetic side of it. And so you can use these types of devices essentially to train your body and to train your physiology. And it's very helpful for meditation, very, very helpful for meditation, because they provide an objective view into physiological processes that otherwise you're just trying to struggle with, in your own mind. Another thing that I unfortunately didn't remember to bring in because it was in a different room of the lab was a Muse headset, but you can look those up online. And it's a really beautiful design of an EEG, and they have a meditation app that does a really fantastic job. It's probably the best EEG in the sort of spiritual tech or trans tech space. And so if you want to do it with your brain waves, you can do it with your brain waves, you can do it with your heart, you can do it with GSR, we're doing it with all of it for the next Finder's Course experiment, right? But you can do that at home too. And then there's other things. If you're really, really hardcore, you can use something like this. This is an open EEG that you can buy. And so these are the electrodes. These are active electrodes, and you just basically put them against your scalp in different places. And you can actually, there's about $100 worth of stuff here. And you can get software that allows you to track your brain in more complicated ways. So for instance, there's a company called Transparent Corp in Columbus, Ohio, I believe, who makes something called Mind Workstation, and it can actually take brain feedback in and use video and sort of photonic, meaning flashing lights, and audio stimulation to kind of work around with your brain waves. So it can have a measurement and a stimulation loop and things like that. It's a little bit more fancy, but that type of stuff is out there. And then there's things like this, which is a brain zapper. And so this is probably one of the most aesthetically pleasing brain zappers. It's from a company called Focus. The one they send you may or may not look like this, because this is a development version that doesn't have the restrictions on it, so we can do all kinds of stuff in the lab with it. So it's got a little charging dock, very, very simple. And then there's electrodes, essentially, that you put on. So you take the electrodes, you just plug them into the bottom like this. The electrodes stick on you. And let me tell you what we found over time. Actually, Mikey Siegel, who's another one of your guests that I mentioned earlier, Mikey came over at the time. He was looking for anybody who might be interested in the notion of trans tech and that sort of stuff, and we were the only ones that he found. I was a professor in Hong Kong at the time. And so he came over and actually lived with me for about 8 months or something in Hong Kong and kind of got the download on all of this stuff. And one of the things that we did at that time was we were playing around with brain stimulation devices like what you can buy in that Focus device, except that we basically built our own. And we learned in that period of experimenting that if you put the negative, so there's a negative and a positive pole with these things. If you put the negative pole right around this region, and you put the positive pole on your shoulder, on the bare skin, not through your coat or something, but on the bare skin, and you're you don't have to be a totally expert, amazing meditator, but you're somebody who's meditated for at least a little while. Wouldn't call you don't have to be a 10,000 hour meditator or anything like that, but you're somebody who's had a meditation practice. We saw in meditators that particular montage often takes them to the deepest place that they've experienced in meditation or deeper. So, meditators will often talk about occasionally getting to sort of these deeper places. And so if you want to play around with some brain stimulation stuff, it's really like putting a 9-volt battery to your head.
So do you feel a little tingly electricity when you apply it? You
can. It's okay to basically, turn it up until you feel a little tingle and then turn it down so you don't feel the tingle anymore. Now, our protocol for that was actually 25 to 40 minutes of about 2 milliamps of energy. And these devices, they all have readouts that allow you to set that very easily. Let me show you a cheaper one of those from the UK that I just ordered off eBay, because we have all kinds of devices here that we like to have available. So this is a different it's called a neurozapper, but it does basically the same thing. Here are the electrode pads. I just stuck them to each other for storage. And so we can turn it on here. And you can see it has a very simple display. And then you can control, usually with a knob that's not as digital as the Focus. And so you can control with a knob the intensity, and you can turn it up to, whatever you want. So there you go. It's like 1 milliamp. And so these devices are super easy to use. You have to be a little bit careful with them. Some friends of ours at Harvard, who are really the world's leading experts in this type of stuff, really regard them as safe. If you go to one of their talks or one of their workshops, they have all kinds of safety slides that they show and whatnot. But definitely do some searching online. This isn't me saying go zap your head with this stuff. You should absolutely, do your homework. on it.
So this is a cranial electrical stimulation is what we're talking here?
So this is not cranial electrical stimulation. That's a think device, which I don't have here to show you at the moment. But that's another type of electrical stimulation that is AC. And so there's DC and AC stimulation. Most of the focus devices can do both DC and AC stimulation. And the difference between them is that DC, which is TDCS, or transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS basically conditions your brain to fire or not fire, but it doesn't make it fire or not fire. It doesn't bring it into resonance with anything or anything like that, right? So if you put the negative pole here and the positive pole here, like I said a minute ago, what you're really doing is anything under the negative pole is conditioned to fire less. And so there's something going on with this montage. And I don't think we understand what it is, frankly. It's just an effect that we've learned in meditators from trying a bunch of different montages. But there's something with that montage that, and in this case, this area of your brain, theoretically, would be less likely to fire than other areas of your brain. So you're just conditioning it to be less likely to fire. Now with TACS, or cranial stimulation, transcranial stimulation, things like that, things that use an AC current instead of a DC current, you can modulate the waveform. And what that means is that you can directly stimulate alpha waves, for instance, in the brain, or delta waves or theta waves. So in essence, you can try to bring the brain in resonance with specific frequencies. And then at higher intensities, things that you definitely shouldn't be messing around with at home and hopefully can't get access to, there are things like intense forms of magnetic stimulation that can actually make your neurons fire. And so you can get, people to twitch their arms or twitch their fingers or, all kinds of stuff from that. But most of the things that you can get at home, if not all of the things that you can get at home, are pretty low intensity in their stimulation.
So with this particular montage that you were talking about, have you found that people that have practiced with that for a while can achieve the same states once you take away the technology? Is it something that actually trains the brain to be able to reach these deep states unaided?
I don't know yet. We haven't played around with them enough. The thing is, we're interested in persistent non-symbolic experience. And because that device didn't seem to take people to persistent non-symbolic experience, we did a range of research with it. We piloted research with it. I tell meditators about this because I think it's useful for them to know, and they really can't find out about it anywhere else. But we're not really interested in taking people to deep meditation states. Our own work focuses on persistence. And so I don't know. I just didn't continue that research. Okay. Then there's this, which is one step up from there, which is a God helmet. So maybe you've heard of Dr. Persinger's work.
I have.
Laurentian University. So this is actually an experimental grade God helmet. You can buy these, though, from someone named Todd Murphy. So if you search for like the Shakti and Shiva helmets and things like that, systems, I'm not sure exactly what he calls them. So, this is low intensity magnetic stimulation. And so these are basically just magnetic coils, and they can create sort of a rotating magnetic field, things like that. What they use is either a specific thing like maybe a 40 hertz frequency, or more likely specific brain spikes. So they have recordings from different parts of your brain, like the amygdala or the hippocampus, things like that. And they're literally just sort of playing that back into the brain and seeing if they can get the brain to resonate with it. A magnetic signal is nice because magnetic signals pass through the bone in your head, basically. They pass through your cranium a lot easier than electricity does. So with TDCS or TACS, you lose a lot of the energy just sort of shunting around the outside of the skull, and not very much gets in. Whereas with magnetics, you can get more in. And so that's kind of a fun one. People have all kinds of experiences with that. Let's see what else I've got laying around here real quick for you. So another thing that's a real comer, I think, is VR. Right, so I don't know if you've seen any of the VR headsets. This is a relatively inexpensive one for a Samsung phone. So literally, you just put a Samsung phone in the front there. It was one of Oculus's first products in conjunction with Samsung. This is a popular one for people that have iPhones because you can put almost any phone in front of it. It's about $80, I think. It's called I never know how to pronounce this company's name. I should really ask them. It's HOMIDO. So I don't know how they want that, if they want it Homido, because it's kind of the I's lowercase. But anyway, you can basically just slide a phone in the front there, and it's got some great features, like it's got focusing and eye width, and they include different cones of lenses and all sorts of stuff like that.
And you play a video on your phone, and this takes you into this virtual reality
Yeah, we'll
world.
talk about that in a sec. And then this is the cheapest version that you can buy. These are the Google Cardboard devices where you can slide your phone in the front. And then there's a couple of lenses here. I think it is worth, if you can, spending up to this. If you have a Samsung, you definitely want to get a Samsung Gear. And so so there's all sorts of people that are starting to create VR-oriented meditation apps and stuff like that. If you haven't experienced VR, it's one of those things you just kind of got to experience it to get it. It really does put you in a sensory immersion of another place and time. So there are games that are coming out that are really, powerful and immersive. And there are video stuff, there's films and video things and whatnot coming out that are equally powerful and immersive. I was talking to some people from Hollywood not long ago about all this, because VR is a very interesting place for us. We think a lot of trans tech is going to be ultimately related to VR, when you have probably the third or so generation of of devices like the Oculus coming out. We think that from what we can tell right now, that they're going to basically have sensors that are embedded around these various things. And so you may be able to pick up EEG, GSR, all sorts of stuff like that. And so there's going to be sort of this merging of physiological stuff with these devices. And so if you think a couple of years down the road from now, you have photorealism, basically. You can't tell that it's not real when you're looking in the thing. And it's able to read biosignals. It'll have absolutely eye tracking and pupil dilation and stuff like that by then. You can tell a lot about cognitive load and emotion and stuff from people's eyes. And so it's a really rich feedback. It's a really rich, immersive feedback. We think it's probably going to be the most effective technology for quite a while in terms of producing shifts in consciousness.
Terrific. Boy, that is quite the, I'm not even sure what to compare it to, but what a lab. Anything that we might have missed with the other guests, you really, you rounded it out and filled it out there. That's terrific.
So and there's so many other things like that. There's, we'll see ultrasound coming out, which uses acoustical waves to stimulate deeper brain regions. One of the things that we'll really need, I think, for the PNSE stuff is to get to these deeper brain regions. And that's probably only going to happen with things like ultrasound. The magnetic stuff is a little too surfacey. We have a group here in the lab that's trying to use artificial intelligence to see if they can find surface patterns in the EEG that relate to these deeper brain regions, to see if there's some neurofeedback that can get people to these more advanced states of, higher forms of well-being and all of that. So it's amazing times. It's exciting times. We're all so fortunate. It's just incredible what's going on out there.
And the Finder's course is something that's done online, correct? So as long as you're hooked up to the internet, you can participate wherever.
Yeah, exactly. There's you can go to finderscourse.com and sign up for the mailing list, and we'll get when we do new ones, we send out to that mailing list. The experiment page, we kind of have a secret experiment page up right now, and I believe that it's fc2016.transtechlab.org. And so if you just want to get on, if you really want to cut the line, you just want to get right on the direct mailing list, the short mailing list, priority mailing list for the April and early May experiment before we announce it more broadly, then that URL should work.
Boy, we could talk about a lot of other things, but I think that's really sufficient for right now. I'd love to hear your personal story sometime, how you came to all this and how you got on this particular path. And Dr. Jeffery, thank you so much. This has been, dare I say, enlightening and fascinating, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. You put together such an amazing series of people. I just can't believe how many awesome people you have. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm awed too. I keep on wanting to take my shoes off. I'm in holy ground. I mean, there's just so much beautiful wisdom and energy that's been transmitted here in the last, and thanks for our technological noosphere, the internet, that we're able to do this sort of thing now. So all the stuff is developing, and we have the methods of sharing. It's just a tremendous time to be alive and doing this work.